Often you talk about one way to find meaning is in the journey between who you are and who you could be. But how do you make sure that when deciding like who you could be, that you're not aiming too high?
Right.
Because then potentially you could be disappointed.
Oh, that's
so,
a good. That's
but
a
how
really,
do you make sure that it's challenging enough to keep you engaged?
Yeah, that's a really good question. Yeah. Well, that's something you encounter practically in a clinical setting all the time. Well, let's say I was dealing with a client, and maybe that was somebody who, say, a man, 35 years old. He still lived at home, so he was too dependent. His room is a complete bloody catastrophe, and he's living like a bratty 13-year-old, and that gets pretty ugly by the time you're 35. And he knew it, and I'm sure his mother knew it, although obviously she put up with it, which was probably her mistake, at least in part. But maybe we decide, well, let's start by cleaning your room. And so as a cognitive behavioral psychologist, you engage in a process called collaborative empiricism. And that's partly to solve the problem that you described as well. How do we know we set the right goal? Well, I'd say, well, go try it. And just watch yourself like you don't know who you are, and come back next week and we'll see how you did. And maybe, I remember this one client, he came back and he said, I went and got the vacuum cleaner from the closet, which is something I really never done, and I put that vacuum cleaner in the doorway of my bedroom, crossways, so it blocked the doorway, and then I just walked over it for a whole week. And he was completely nonplussed at his own intransigence. And look what he did, eh? He was so resentful and so angry that he, instead of vacuuming his damn bedroom like he planned, he just stuck the vacuum in his own way and then martyred himself over it every day for a week. It's like, okay, then we're starting to get somewhere with the whole you living at home thing here. And so, well, that was too high a goal for him. And you say, well, how do you know that? It's like, well, he didn't do it, did he? So then what you do practically is you say, well, how about you bring that vacuum cleaner into your room this week, and that's your whole assignment. And just watch what happens when you bring it in. Watch the fantasies that flicker in the back of your mind as you live out your resentment at your therapist for daring to make you bring that vacuum across the threshold of your bedroom. And so if people catch those fantasies, that's quite the bloody nightmare and quite the revelation to themselves, I can tell you, because you have to be one angry person to put a vacuum cleaner in your doorway and walk over it every day for a week. And so then we'd get somewhere. It's like, okay, now we're getting to the bottom of things, but maybe the next week he'd come back, well, with the fantasies at hand and rather shocked as a consequence, but the vacuum cleaner was then in his room. And so he broke the threshold there. And then maybe all he could do was sort out a drawer or half a drawer, something like that. So what you do is, you pick a target that you think is probably reasonable, and you can negotiate that with yourself. What I would do often practically with my clients is I would say, well, your life is not going very well, and that's why you're here. I mean, that wasn't a pronouncement on my part. And I would ask them, what problems they were suffering from, what they were suffering from. But I would usually do a pragmatic analysis of the generic quality of their life. And it's not that hard to do. You can do this for yourself. It's part of this self-authoring program that I have online. Well, I'm miserable and I'm anxious and I'm bitter and I'm angry and I'm stuck in my career and I don't seem to be able to get anywhere, and God damn it, life isn't worth living anyways, and so half the time I'm suicidal. It's like, okay, right? Now we've established the problem domain, right? At least somewhat. And then I would say, well, hypothetically, you'd rather that some of that wasn't the case, right? So because we want to establish a goal, what is it you want? More misery or less misery? And usually by the time people had come to therapy, unless they were mandated to do so, which never works, by the way, they wanted things to be better. That's why they were there. Now and then you get someone who was there just to, maybe please someone else, but I could usually get beyond that, because if they were willing to come there was at least a part of them that was hoping that there was such a thing as up. And then we'd just walk through their life. It's like, okay, well, let's do an assessment. Do you have any friends? How often do you see them? Well, I have 6 friends, but I only see them once every 6 months, one of them every 6 months. Well, that's pretty low on the friendship hierarchy. So I just file that away as a piece of evidence. Do you have an intimate relationship? Are you as educated as your intelligence would indicate might be useful? Do you have a job? Do you have a career? Or failing that, a job? Right? Because generally people need at least a job and perhaps hopefully a career. How do you regulate your drug and alcohol use? Because that's a major pitfall for people. How do you use your leisure time? And how do you take care of yourself mentally and physically? Now, that's not everything about life, right? But if you don't have any of that, well, we have a place to start then, like maybe you should try to make one friend. And there are ways of doing that. So, for example, one of the things that my wife and I used to do when we moved to a new place, which we did fairly often, was we'd pick some local hangout place, restaurant, bar, something like that, and we just go there every week. And until we started to know at least the proprietors, we'd introduce ourselves and we'd make that a routine. And then, you can get to know people. And sometimes with my clients, I would have to, some of them were incredibly not socially skilled, like in ways you just have no idea. Well, maybe some of you do. How? Well, because I don't mean you specifically, although maybe I do, but you certainly may know people like this. I had one client who was literally so socially anxious he could not use a telephone. And so he was he was absolutely terrified of people. He'd been horribly bullied. He was 3/4 deaf. He had obsessive compulsive disorder. He had an intellectual impairment. I mean, this guy had a rough time, man. And he was so terrified he could hardly talk to men and women, man. They were so terrifying to him. He just didn't even know literally where to start. Well, sometimes when people are extremely impaired, they don't know anything basic. They have no friends. That's why. Well, they introduce themselves like this. What's your name? And then maybe you say it, but they're so preoccupied that they don't hear it, and then they shake hands. So let's shake hands. That's not good. That's not good. You don't remember the name. You're not making eye contact, so you can't see the person's emotional response, and then you're afraid, and that's why you're looking away. And then because you're afraid and you're looking away, you don't pick up the social cues about how to initiate conversation, even if you know how to do that. So then you're awkward, and because you're looking away, you don't listen, and then you can't enter into the flow of conversation. And so we'd practice shaking hands, maybe 20 times till the person could do it and was comfortable with it. And that's how you start at the bottom of things. I mean, the guy had a lot of obstacles standing in his way, and so we had to find, a place to start. But we would set those 7 goals. It's like, well, maybe you could have a friend or 2, and maybe you could do something that would educate yourself to some degree, and maybe we can take some steps towards moving you towards a job. With him, I started trying to get him a volunteer job, which you'd think would be easy, but which is actually practically, just so you know it, when you're thinking about people struggling at the bottom who are unemployed, it's like, why don't they get a volunteer job, say, to start them in the process? It's bloody well harder to get a volunteer job than a real job. You need a police check for most volunteer positions if they deal with personal care, because people are so afraid of litigation. And for someone who's basically illiterate and also who has extreme social anxiety, the whole police check thing wasn't working. And I sent him to an employment office, and they said, well, type up your resume and distribute it. It's like, that's real helpful. He can't type, he's barely literate. He's never used a computer. He doesn't know what a resume is even. It's like, type up your resume and distribute it. Jesus, how pathetic. So one of the things you do if you negotiate with yourself is set a goal and then see if you move towards it. And if you don't, well, maybe it's the wrong goal. Maybe it's too large. Maybe it's too small for you, right? So now it's not engaging you. Maybe you didn't really want to pursue that goal and you're just deluding yourself. And, it's helpful to have someone to talk those things over with. But I would say start from if you're not doing what you want to do or what you think you should be doing, drop the presumption that you know who you are. And start to negotiate with yourself like you're a stranger who needs to be enticed forward.